Monday night, the sky over Buenos Aires turned green. A fireball, electric, fast, and violent, tore across one of the most populated cities in the Western Hemisphere at 40,000 kilometers per hour. Security cameras caught it from every angle. AccuWeather logged the speed, and then, before anyone had finished asking what that was, i.e. within 48 hours, the sky did it again. British Columbia, over 100 reports filed before most people had their morning coffee, and then a third green light. Hawaii, same window, same eerie colour, same unanswered silence from the databases that are supposed to track exactly this. 3 continents, 72 hours, one narrow window that, according to the only peer-reviewed science that exists on this, should have been closed on April 7th. We are 20 days past that. The model said, stop. The solar system did not stop. And while all of this was unfolding across 3 continents, a 5-meter asteroid slipped silently past Earth inside our own satellite ring without a single public warning issued. Stay with me, because this is much deeper than a fireball story. The science says the surge is over. What then is Earth still flying through? If this already has you asking questions, hit like and subscribe to the Sky Lab, because this story is nowhere near finished. The model closed on April 7th. The fireballs didn't. New events are still coming in, the data is still being analysed, and the deeper you go into what this pattern is actually telling us, the more important it becomes to have someone connecting the dots. That is exactly what you will want to be here when the next piece of this puzzle drops. Now let us get into it. Part 1. The window that shouldn't exist. Something lit up the sky over Buenos Aires on the night of April 27, 2026, and for a few seconds 13 million people had the same thought. What was that? No warning, no announcement, no countdown, just darkness and then light, a violent electric green that turned night into something close to day for a brief, disorienting moment before the sky went dark again and left everyone staring upward with the same unanswered question hanging over one of the largest cities in the Western Hemisphere. Let's start with the raw facts, because the facts alone are enough to stop you cold. The event occurred at approximately 10:51 p.m. local time on April 27th. The fireball was classified as a green bolide, a meteoroid entering the atmosphere at such speed and with such composition that it burns with that distinctive, almost electric emerald colour. AccuWeather clocked its entry velocity at over 40,000 kilometers per hour. That's roughly 11 kilometers every single second. To give you a sense of what that means, in the time it takes you to blink, that object had already travelled further than the length of a major highway. It didn't sneak across the sky. It punched through the atmosphere like it had somewhere to be, and no patience for anything in its way. Security cameras across the city caught it from multiple angles. Independent footage from dashcams, home systems, and street surveillance all confirmed what hundreds of naked eye witnesses had already reported. A brilliant, fast-moving object trailing a persistent vapour trail and dragging what some witnesses described as a plasma cap behind it. The kind of feature that says, this is not small, and this is not slow. And here's the first thing that should make you pause. As of the time of reporting, the American Meteor Society, which is the primary English-language database for fireball events in the Western Hemisphere, had 0 entries for this event. 0. An object that crossed the sky over one of the most densely populated urban areas in the entire Western Hemisphere, witnessed by potentially millions of people, captured on dozens of independent cameras, logged by AccuWeather's meteorological tracking system, and the main fireball database didn't have a single record of it. We're going to come back to that, because it's not just an administrative gap. It tells us something uncomfortable about what we think we know versus what we're actually measuring. Now hold that thought, because within 48 hours, the sky did it again. British Columbia, Canada, April 29th, a second fireball. Different continent, different direction, different witnesses, but similar brightness class, similar behaviour, similar green signature. And this time, the American Meteor Society did log it. Over 100 reports flooded in within less than a day. Witnesses across the Canadian province reported the same kind of fast, bright, greenish streak that Buenos Aires had seen 2 days earlier. By AMS standards, 100 reports in under 24 hours is a significant event. It made it into the database, it got counted, is part of the official record. And then, overlapping with both of those events, within that same narrow 48 to 72 hour window, There was a third signal, Hawaii Island, specifically the Kona area, a green light crossing the sky, filmed by at least one witness, circulating on social media, drawing the kind of confused attention that unusual aerial phenomena always produces. Was it a meteoroid? Was it a re-entering piece of satellite debris? Was it something else entirely? Classification is still uncertain at the time of this recording, but the timing is hard to dismiss. 3 unusual sky events, South America, Pacific Northwest, Central Pacific, all clustered inside 3 days. Think about what that geographic spread actually means. Buenos Aires sits at roughly 60 degrees west longitude. British Columbia is around 125 degrees west. Hawaii is closer to 155 degrees west. Spread that out and you're looking at events distributed across nearly 200 degrees of longitude in under 3 days. That's more than half the Earth's circumference represented in a single short window. These weren't localized. These weren't confined to one part of the sky or one corner of the planet. They came from different directions, different trajectories, different witness populations, and they all happened in the same brief slice of time. That pattern matters. And it matters more when you add the next layer, because here's the piece that almost nobody's connecting right now, and it's the reason this video exists. There is exactly one peer-reviewed scientific paper that attempted to explain the dramatic surge in fireball activity that began in March 2026. 1. It was authored by a researcher named Patrick M. Schober, and it identified a newly characterized debris stream, designated M2026A1, originating from what the model described as a rock comet, an asteroid behaving like a comet due to solar heating, fragmenting gradually and spreading debris along its orbital path. The paper used 282 meteor detections from coordinated global networks. It went through peer review, it was scientifically rigorous, and it gave a precise active window for when Earth would be passing through that debris. March 16th to April 7th, 2026. April 7th. That is the date the model said the window would close. The Buenos Aires fireball happened on April 27th. The British Columbia fireball happened on April 29th. The Hawaii event overlapped with both. These events occurred 20 to 22 days after the stream was supposed to have ended. Not a day or two of lingering tail activity that could be rounded off. 20 days. And they're happening at a time when the AMS database is already tracking April as a month running at 2.5 times the historical baseline. With multiple days still remaining on the calendar at the time of this reporting, and with the Buenos Aires event not even included in that count. So if the Schober stream is closed, what is Earth still flying through? That is the question at the center of everything that follows. Not a rhetorical question, not a scare tactic opener, a genuine, unanswered scientific question that the current data does not resolve. Because we have a precise model, we have a precise window, and we have real events occurring outside that window at a rate that doesn't look like coincidence, residual noise, or natural decay. We're going to spend this video pulling apart what the data actually shows, what the model actually predicted, where the gap between those two things lives, and what it might mean, not just for this April, but for our broader understanding of what Earth is moving through right now. And along the way, we're going to run into some things that should genuinely concern you. Things about how we detect fireballs, things about what we miss, things about a 5-meter asteroid that passed Earth inside geosynchronous orbit recently, without a single public warning being issued. Things about data systems that carry enormous scientific weight, while covering less than a third of the planet's surface area. We know something unusual is happening. We have data showing that. We have a model that partially explains it and then falls short. And we have a planet full of detection systems that were not designed for what we appear to be experiencing right now. Stay with me. Because the window was supposed to close, it didn't. And that means we need to start asking different questions. Part 2. The Buenos Aires event as a data anomaly. Let's go back to Buenos Aires for a moment, because I want to reframe what happened there, not as a spectacular sky show, but as a measurement failure. When a fireball crosses the sky over a major city, the scientific community learns about it through reports. Witness accounts submitted to databases like the American Meteor Society, security camera footage uploaded and tagged, news stories that reference specific timestamps and coordinates. These reports are the raw material that scientists use to reconstruct trajectories, estimate masses, and classify events. Without reports, an event might as well have never happened as far as the official scientific record is concerned. And the number of reports an event generates is not random. It's roughly proportional to the number of people who saw it, the cultural and technological infrastructure available for reporting, and the existing awareness in that population of what to do when they see something unusual in the sky. Buenos Aires has a metropolitan population of somewhere between 13 and 15 million people. It is one of the 5 or 6 most populous urban areas in the entire Western Hemisphere. Its greater metro area is densely built, extensively monitored by security cameras, and connected by modern communications infrastructure. When something bright crosses the sky over Buenos Aires at 11 p.m. on a clear night, millions of people potentially see it. The statistical expectation for a bolide of that brightness crossing over a population centre of that size should yield somewhere in the range of 50 to 150 reports to the AMS, and that's a conservative estimate based on events of similar magnitude over comparably populated North American and European areas. The actual number of AMS reports for the Buenos Aires event at the time of this recording: 0. Not a handful, not a few, 0. Now, before you take that as proof of something nefarious, let's talk about the completely mundane explanation, because it actually reveals something more disturbing than a cover-up would. The AMS is an English-language platform. Its primary user base is concentrated in North America and, to a lesser extent, Western Europe. Its reporting interface, its outreach, its cultural penetration, all of it is optimized for a specific geographic and linguistic slice of the global population. South America as a whole is dramatically underrepresented in AMS data relative to its actual population and sky-watching activity. An event over Buenos Aires that generates massive local coverage in Spanish-language media simply does not translate automatically into AMS entries because the pipeline between witness and database was never built with that witness in mind. This is what scientists sometimes call dark data. Not data that was suppressed, data that was generated, events that happened, were observed, were recorded, but never entered the systems we rely on to understand what's occurring in near-Earth space. The Buenos Aires fireball is a perfect example. Multiple independent video captures confirmed the event. AccuWeather tracked it. Local social media lit up with witness accounts. Every component of a properly documented fireball event was present, and yet, from the perspective of the most widely cited fireball database in the world, the event does not exist. Here's why that matters for the central question we're tracking. We're already looking at April 2026 as a month running at 2.5 times the historical baseline for major fireball events. That figure comes from AMS data. It counts events that generated significant reports in the database. It does not count events that were seen and logged locally in countries with lower database penetration. It does not count events over ocean, which is 71% of the planet's surface. It does not count the Buenos Aires bolide. So when we say April is tracking at 2.5 times baseline, we need to understand that number as a floor, not a ceiling. The true rate of significant fireball activity in April 2026 is at minimum 2.5 times historical average, and almost certainly higher. Now let's look at what the physical characteristics of the Buenos Aires event actually tell us. The persistent vapor trail is significant. When a meteoroid enters the atmosphere, the ionized gases left in its wake, the plasma channel it carves through the air, can persist for seconds to minutes depending on the object's size, speed, and trajectory. A long, persistent trail suggests an object substantial enough to maintain structural integrity through the upper atmosphere rather than fragmenting immediately on contact. The plasma cap that witnesses described, a kind of luminous envelope around the leading edge of the object, is consistent with a fast-moving body creating its own shock-heated bubble of ionized gas as it plows through increasingly dense air. The absence of obvious fragmentation in the footage is also notable. Many fireball events show clear fragmentation, the parent body breaking into multiple pieces that spread and brighten as they separate. The Buenos Aires footage shows a coherent object on a consistent trajectory. That suggests either a structurally robust body or an object that was moving so fast relative to its size that it consumed itself more through ablation, surface burning, than through mechanical breakup. Either interpretation points toward an object of meaningful size and density. And then there's the colour. Green. That specific green emission signature in fireball events is typically attributed to magnesium. specifically the spectral emission lines of ionized magnesium at around 518 nanometers, right in the middle of the visible green portion of the spectrum. Magnesium-rich composition isn't unusual for meteoroids. It's actually fairly common among stony objects. But here's what makes it interesting in context. The British Columbia fireball 2 days later was also described with a green signature. The Hawaii event was described with a green light. 3 events in 72 hours, spread across nearly 200 degrees of longitude, all carrying that same characteristic spectral marker. Is that a coincidence? It might be. Common compositional signatures do show up in unrelated objects, but it might also suggest a shared origin, fragments from the same parent body or debris field with similar mineralogy. And that possibility, quiet as it is, points right back to the central thread. If these events share a compositional origin, and that origin is debris field related, and that debris field was supposed to have finished crossing Earth's path 20 days ago, then either the field is larger than the model predicted, or there are multiple fields we haven't yet characterized, or something about our model of how debris streams disperse is fundamentally incomplete. The absence of coordinated trajectory analysis for the Buenos Aires event is also worth naming explicitly. With multiple independent video captures from different angles across a large city, it is technically possible to reconstruct the approximate trajectory, entry angle, and, with enough camera data, the pre-atmospheric orbit of the object. This is how scientists determined that several recent fireball events shared radiance with specific debris streams. But that kind of reconstruction requires someone to do the work. It requires the event to be recognized as scientifically significant. It requires the footage to be assembled, calibrated, and processed. For Buenos Aires, that work had not been done at the time of this recording. Another data point that exists in principle and nowhere in practice. The absence of data is not silence. It's distortion. It's a funhouse mirror that reflects back a picture of near-Earth space that is systematically biased toward the places we built our instruments and the languages we designed our reporting systems in. And when we're trying to understand whether a debris surge has genuinely ended, or whether it's continuing at an intensity that exceeds our model's predictions, that distortion isn't a minor inconvenience. It's the difference between thinking we understand what's happening and actually understanding it. Because here's the uncomfortable implication sitting at the bottom of all of this. If the Buenos Aires fireball is dark data, real, confirmed, uncounted, then how many other events have gone uncounted? How many bolides have crossed southern Africa, Central Asia, the South Pacific, the Amazon basin? How many events in the weeks since April 7th have occurred outside the geographic reach of our reporting infrastructure? We're tracking an anomaly with instruments that cover perhaps 30 to 40% of the planet's sky effectively, and the anomaly is still outrunning our best model. That's the picture in South America. Now let's cross to Canada, where the same week looks completely different. Not because the sky behaved differently, but because the infrastructure did. Part 3. The Canadian Contrast. The British Columbia fireball arrived in the American Meteor Society database fast, over 100 reports in less than a day. By the time you were reading about it on social media, the data was already being processed. That speed is not accidental. It reflects years of deliberate public outreach. North American skywatchers are culturally primed to report unusual events. There are apps, websites, social media communities, local astronomy clubs, dedicated networks, all feeding into a pipeline that was specifically designed to capture exactly this kind of data. When something bright crosses the sky over Vancouver Island or the Fraser Valley, tens of thousands of people who know exactly what to do with that experience reach for their phones and log it. The infrastructure works. It functions almost exactly as intended. Now compare that to the Buenos Aires event, not because the Buenos Aires event was less real, less bright, or less significant. It wasn't. By all available evidence, it was at minimum comparable in magnitude, and possibly more dramatic given the plasma cap and persistent trail. The difference wasn't in the sky, it was on the ground. It was in the reporting culture, the language of the platform, the geographic reach of the outreach networks, and the simple historical fact that the American Meteor Society was built by and for a primarily North American English-speaking audience. This asymmetry has profound consequences for how we understand the current surge. Every statistical analysis of the fireball anomaly, including the work we're going to discuss in the next act, draws on databases that are structurally weighted toward North America and Western Europe. When researchers say March 2026 was a 4.5 sigma anomaly, they're working with data that is already biased toward the part of the world where reporting is most robust. The sigma is calculated against a baseline that itself reflects the same geographic bias. We're comparing the number we see now to the number we typically see, but both numbers are drawn from the same incomplete sample. What does that mean in practice? It means the actual magnitude of the current surge, in terms of real fireball events occurring globally, is almost certainly higher than what the database reflects. The 2.5 times baseline number for April is derived from a dataset that misses 71% of Earth's surface and significantly undercounts large portions of the inhabited landmass. If we could somehow capture every significant fireball event on the planet with equal efficiency, regardless of language, geography, or reporting infrastructure, the number might be 3 times baseline. It might be 4 times. We genuinely don't know, and that uncertainty matters enormously when we're trying to assess whether the surge is dying down or continuing. And this connects directly back to the M2026A1 window problem. The model predicted activity ending April 7th. The database shows elevated activity continuing well beyond that. But the database also undercounts activity in the southern hemisphere and parts of the developing world, where fireball events are less likely to be logged. If the post-window activity is partially distributed in those undercounted regions, which the geographic spread of the April events suggests it might be, then the actual deviation from the model's predictions is even larger than the recorded numbers show. The contrast between Argentina and Canada isn't just an administrative curiosity. It's a window into the structural limitations of the entire global monitoring system. We have highly effective detection in some parts of the world and near zero detection in others, and we use the data from the highly effective zones to make claims about what's happening globally. The British Columbia fireball got counted because the infrastructure was there. The Buenos Aires fireball didn't get counted because the infrastructure wasn't. The sky treated them equally. We didn't. And that asymmetry is one of the reasons why we keep being surprised. Not because the events are unprecedented, but because we keep measuring them with tools that weren't designed for the scale of what we're encountering right now. The anomaly may be bigger than reported, almost certainly is, and the window that was supposed to close 3 weeks ago may still be very much open. We just can't fully see it, which brings us to that third signal from Hawaii, quieter, less certain, but sitting in that same impossible window. Part 4. The quiet, third signal. The Hawaii observation is the most uncertain of the 3 events in this cluster, and I want to be precise about what that means, because precision matters more here than a clean narrative. A green light was filmed crossing the sky over the Kona area of Hawaii Island, within the same 48 to 72 hour window as the Buenos Aires and British Columbia events. It circulated on social media the way these things do. Fragments of footage, conflicting captions, people arguing in comment sections about whether it was a meteor or a satellite or something stranger. Multiple people in the area reported seeing something unusual. The accounts were consistent enough to take seriously. But as of the time of this recording, there is no confirmed classification in any major database. It has not been definitively identified as a meteoroid. It has not been conclusively ruled out as a re-entering piece of satellite debris or a spent rocket stage making its final uncontrolled descent back into the atmosphere. It has not been assigned a formal trajectory by any monitoring network. It exists right now in that uncomfortable scientific middle ground where something clearly happened and nobody has officially said what. And I want to sit with that ambiguity for a moment, because it is actually more scientifically interesting than a clean classification would be. Here is something that does not get discussed enough in fireball coverage. Not everything that enters Earth's atmosphere from space is a meteoroid. That sounds obvious when you say it out loud, but the practical implication tends to get lost. Earth is currently orbited by thousands of artificial objects, defunct satellites that ran out of fuel and have been slowly losing altitude for years, spent rocket bodies from launches going back to the 1960s, fragments from on-orbit collisions and breakups that have created cascading clouds of smaller debris in low Earth orbit. These objects re-enter the atmosphere continuously. Most of them are small enough to burn up completely without anyone noticing. But occasionally something larger comes down, and when it does, it can produce a visual display that is superficially difficult to distinguish from a natural meteor event. a streak of light, a glowing trail, sometimes a green or blue tint from the metallic components burning off. Witnesses on the ground see light moving fast across the sky, and they report what they see, which is a light moving fast across the sky. The database then has to figure out what that light actually was. The distinguishing factors between a natural meteoroid and an artificial re-entry are real and measurable, but they require good data to apply. Velocity is the most reliable discriminator. Natural meteoroids enter the atmosphere at speeds ranging from roughly 11 km per second at the slow end to 72 km per second at the fast end, depending on whether they are catching up to Earth or hitting it head-on. Artificial debris re-enters much more slowly, typically between 7 and 8 km per second, which is orbital velocity, the minimum speed needed to stay in orbit in the first place. That difference in speed produces visibly different behaviour. A fast natural meteoroid burns intensely and quickly, often fragmenting violently as aerodynamic stress tears it apart. A slow, artificial re-entry tends to produce a longer, more graceful arc, frequently with multiple pieces separating cleanly and drifting apart as different components burn at different rates. Trajectory angle matters too. Natural meteoroids arrive from interplanetary space and hit the atmosphere at steep angles. Artificial objects in decaying orbits tend to re-enter at shallower angles, tracing longer visible paths across the sky. And fragmentation pattern is perhaps the most visually distinctive feature. The clean separation of large recognizable pieces that characterizes an artificial re-entry looks quite different from the explosive breakup of a rocky meteoroid under aerodynamic stress. The Hawaii footage is consistent with either interpretation, and that is the honest assessment. The speed is genuinely difficult to gauge precisely from the available video without calibration references in the frame. The trajectory angle is ambiguous from the single viewpoint captured. The green colour, which we have already discussed as a spectral signature associated with magnesium emission in natural meteoroids, is not a reliable discriminator here, because spacecraft components and rocket body structures frequently incorporate magnesium alloys that produce exactly the same green emission when they burn. You cannot look at a green fireball and conclude natural versus artificial from colour alone. The green just tells you there is magnesium burning. It does not tell you where the magnesium came from. Now I want to be direct about something. I am not going to overstate this event, and I am not going to use its ambiguity to inflate the narrative beyond what the evidence actually supports. The Hawaii observation is in this story as a contextual detail, not a primary data point. The Buenos Aires event is real, confirmed by multiple independent video systems, logged by AccuWeather, witnessed by a massive urban population, physically characterized well enough to describe the persistent vapor trail and plasma cap. The British Columbia event is real. Over 100 reports filed with the American Meteor Society, independently corroborated, fully logged. Those two events are the foundation of the post-window argument. The Hawaii event does not need to be a confirmed bolide for that argument to stand. Remove it entirely from the picture, and the central question remains exactly as sharp and exactly as unanswered. What the Hawaii observation contributes is something more subtle. It adds texture to the density of the window. 3 unusual sky events reported across 3 distinct geographic regions within 72 hours, even if one of them turns out to be artificial debris rather than a natural meteoroid, tells you something about the intensity of the period. The temporal clustering itself is a data point. It represents the kind of concentrated attention that unusual atmospheric events generate when they occur in close succession, and that attention is part of how the scientific record gets built. But more importantly, the Hawaii uncertainty illustrates a challenge that compounds every other problem we have been discussing. Our difficulties with the current surge are not limited to reporting gaps and geographic blind spots. We also face classification uncertainty, situations where something enters the atmosphere, gets filmed by real people in real locations, circulates through real reporting channels, and still cannot be definitively categorized by the systems that are supposed to tell us what it was. The identification problem sits on top of the detection problem, which sits on top of the reporting problem, which sits on top of the modeling problem. These are not separate issues. They are layers of the same structural limitation, and each layer makes the one beneath it harder to resolve. We are not always certain about what we're seeing, even when we can see it. That is a sentence worth letting land properly. We have the footage, we have the witness accounts, we have the timestamp and the location, and we still cannot tell you with confidence whether what crossed the sky over Kona was a rock from interplanetary space or a piece of human-built hardware completing its final orbit. That uncertainty is not a failure of any individual scientist or monitoring network. It is a consequence of building our observation infrastructure for a specific set of expected phenomena and then encountering conditions that stress test the boundaries of what that infrastructure was designed to handle. The Hawaii event adds one more layer to a picture that is already more complicated than any single model can describe. It is a reminder that the question of what we are flying through is not just about the rocks. It is about our capacity to see them, identify them, count them, and understand them. And right now, that capacity is running up against its limits in ways that matter. Because the next place we need to go is the model itself. The precise, peer-reviewed, scientifically rigorous model that gave us a specific end date and a specific radiant cluster and a specific physical mechanism. And then watch 20 days of post-window events accumulate without offering any explanation for why they exist. That is where this story gets genuinely uncomfortable, and that is exactly where we are headed next. Part 5. March was not noise. Before we can fully understand why April's persistence is so significant, we need to understand what March was, not what it felt like from the outside. A string of viral fireball videos, social media clips of green streaks over cities, the occasional news segment about a loud boom rattling windows somewhere in the Midwest. What March actually was, statistically, when you sit down with the data and do the math carefully and honestly. Because the math is genuinely startling. Start with the baseline. The American Meteor Society logs major fireball events significant enough to generate more than 100 witness reports, at a historical average of roughly 2 per month. 2. That number accounts for the natural variation in the meteor environment, the seasonal rhythms of Earth's orbit, the predictable annual showers that spike activity in specific months. The Perseids peak in August, the Leonids peak in November, the Geminids peak in December. Researchers who work with this data know those spikes are coming, model them out of the baseline, and arrive at that 2 per month figure as the genuine background rate for significant atmospheric entries that aren't explained by known, characterized annual streams. March 2026 produced 12 events at that threshold, 12 major fireballs in a single month against a baseline of 2. That is not mild elevation. That is not a month where you shrug and say conditions were slightly unusual. That is a factor of 6 increase over the expected rate. And when a researcher named Mike Hankey, who has produced some of the most detailed and methodologically careful public analysis of this anomaly, ran the statistics formally, he characterized the deviation as approximately 4.5 sigma. Let me translate that for anyone who doesn't spend their days thinking about standard deviations. 1 sigma is the kind of fluctuation that happens all the time and means essentially nothing. 2 sigma gets your attention briefly before you move on. 3 sigma is uncommon enough that scientists take note and start asking questions. 4 sigma is rare enough that in most fields it would be considered strong preliminary evidence that something genuinely different is occurring. 4.5 sigma is the kind of number that, in a properly functioning scientific community, triggers immediate investigation, emergency funding conversations, and serious inquiry into whether the underlying assumptions of your baseline model are still valid. It is not noise. It is not a seasonal quirk that got slightly out of hand. It is an extreme statistical outlier by any reasonable definition of that phrase. But here is where I need you to stay focused, because the raw event count, 12 versus 2, factor of 6, 4.5 sigma, is actually the least interesting part of what Hankey found. It is the headline number. It is not the full story, and the full story is considerably more unsettling. The sonic boom rate for March 2026 fireball events was 79%. 79. Let that number sit for a moment before we unpack it. Sonic booms are not produced by every fireball. They are produced by objects that are large enough, dense enough, and entering at the right angle to penetrate sufficiently deep into the atmosphere that the shock wave they generate actually reaches the ground as audible sound. A small, fragile meteoroid, a loosely bound aggregate of dust and ice, the kind of thing that makes up most of the visible meteors in an annual shower, burns up high in the upper atmosphere and produces a brilliant streak of light with no accompanying sound at ground level. The sonic boom is the calling card of a different kind of object, denser, heavier, more structurally robust. The kind of rock that doesn't just graze the upper atmosphere and disintegrate, it pushes through, deeper, harder, until the air column it's ploughing through compresses violently enough to send a pressure wave rolling across the landscape below. A typical significant fireball event produces a sonic boom at a rate considerably lower than 79%. The March rate being that high tells you something specific and important about the physical character of the March events. These were not wispy particles, they were not delicate fluffy aggregates of cometary dust. They were rocks, dense, structurally coherent, mechanically strong enough to survive the initial atmospheric entry and push deep before breaking up or burning out. The size distribution of the March event skewed toward the large end of the small body range, and that characteristic, the size skew, matters enormously when you're trying to understand what population of objects Earth was encountering. Then there is the duration data. This is the detail that I think most clearly illustrates the true scale of what happened in March, and it is almost never included in the popular coverage. Prior to March 2026, the all-time monthly record for long-duration fireball events logged by the American Meteor Society in a single calendar month was 651. Long-duration events are defined as fireballs where the visible luminous phase persists for a meaningful period, more than a second or two of continuous brightness, which implies an object large enough or slow enough to maintain its ablation over an extended atmospheric path rather than simply exploding in a brief intense flash. 651 was the record, set at some point in the previous years of AMS operation, the previous high water mark. The number that defined what an exceptionally active month looked like. March 2026 logged 1,693 long-duration events. 1,693, against a previous record of 651. That is not breaking the record. That is erasing it. That is posting a number that is more than 2.5 times the previous high in a category that specifically tracks the larger, slower, more physically substantial end of the fireball size distribution in a single month, while simultaneously posting 12 major events against a baseline of 2, a 4.5 sigma frequency deviation, and a 79% sonic boom rate that tells you these were real, heavy, ground-shaking rocks. The picture that emerges from those three numbers together is not a statistical blip. It is a coherent physical signal pointing in a consistent direction. In March 2026, Earth encountered an elevated flux of objects that were above average in size, above average in structural integrity, and arriving in numbers so far outside historical norms that the word anomaly barely covers it. And then the radiant data adds another layer entirely. A fireball's radiant, the point in the sky from which its trajectory mathematically originates, is the fingerprint that tells you where an object came from. Objects from the same debris stream share a radiant. They arrive from the same patch of sky, travelling along parallel paths, like rain falling from a single direction. Objects from different sources have different radiants. The radiant analysis for March 2026 showed a doubling in what researchers call high declination events. Fireballs arriving from parts of the sky that are relatively unusual in the historical dataset, directions that don't correspond to the well-characterized annual streams whose geometry is already well understood. That doubling in unusual arrival directions is significant on its own, but the most striking radiant detail from March involves two specific events that stand apart from everything else. In March 2026, two separate fireball events produced meteorite falls, actual physical fragments that survived atmospheric entry and reached the ground. Meteorite-producing events are rare. They require a specific combination of object size, composition, entry angle, and entry velocity that allows fragments to decelerate below the ablation threshold and land intact rather than vaporizing completely. 2 in a single month is already statistically notable, but the radiants of those two events were separated by approximately 98 degrees from each other. 98 degrees. Stand at the center of a clock face and point at the 10, then rotate your arm to point at the 7. That is roughly the angular separation we're talking about. Two meteorite-producing events in the same calendar month, arriving from directions in the sky that are almost 100 degrees apart. The probability that both of those events were members of the same discrete debris stream, travelling along the same orbital track, originating from the same parent body, is extremely low. The geometry simply does not allow it. You cannot have two objects from the same narrow stream arriving from directions that far apart. Those objects came from different places. What Hankey concluded after working systematically through every plausible source of observational bias he could identify, reporting improvements, population changes, seasonal factors, instrument sensitivity shifts, was that the March anomaly is real. Genuinely, robustly, multidimensionally real. Not an artifact of better detection, not a consequence of more people having smartphones, not a known annual shower that ran slightly hot, a genuine increase in the rate and size and diversity of objects entering Earth's atmosphere in March 2026, confirmed independently by frequency data, duration data, sonic boom rates, and radiant distribution simultaneously. 4 independent lines of evidence pointing in the same direction. That is what scientists call a robust result. And here is why March matters so much to the April story we are building toward. If March was a genuine 4.5 sigma spike, and the data says it was, then April's failure to decay back toward normal is not a minor footnote. It is the second chapter of a pattern that the M2026A1 model was only designed to describe one chapter of. The model captured March. It set a boundary at April 7th, and then reality kept going. March was not noise. It was a signal so loud and so statistically unambiguous that dismissing it requires actively ignoring multiple independent data streams simultaneously. The question, the one that everything else in this story depends on, is what April is. An echo of that signal fading towards silence, a continuation of it at sustained intensity, or something new entirely, running on mechanisms the March model never accounted for. The data, as we're about to see, is not pointing towards silence. Part 6. April. The failure to return to baseline. When something anomalous happens, you wait for the decay. That is the implicit contract in every debris stream encounter Earth has ever had. Something unusual enters the picture. Activity spikes. Scientists identify the source. Earth moves through the densest concentration of material, the numbers peak, and then, because Earth keeps moving, because orbital mechanics is relentlessly precise, because the stream has a finite width, and Earth crosses it at a known velocity, the curve comes back down, the spike resolves, the anomaly closes, you return to baseline and file the event in the historical record next to every other characterized stream encounter. That is how the Perseids work every August. That is how the Leonids work every November. That is how virtually every documented debris stream interaction in the entire observational history of meteor science works. The spike is bounded. It has geometry. It has a beginning, a densest middle, and a thinning end that fades predictably back into the background. April 2026 does not look like a decaying spike. It does not look like a thinning end. It does not look like a return to baseline. And the longer the month runs, the clearer that becomes. At the time of this recording, with days still remaining on the April calendar, the American Meteor Society database was already tracking 5 or more major fireball events for the month. Events that crossed the 100 witness report threshold that defines a significant atmospheric entry in the AMS classification system. 5 against a historical baseline of roughly 2 per month. That puts April on pace for a rate of 2.5 times normal, which is almost exactly the rate March ran at. 2 consecutive months, same elevated rate, back to back, no decay between them. But the raw numbers, as striking as they are not the most important part of the April picture. The timing distribution is, because if you look at when in April those major events occurred, which ones drove the elevated count, the majority of them fall after April 7th, not clustered in the first week of the month, when the M2026A1 stream was still technically within its predicted active window, not fading through the second week as Earth moved toward the closure date and beyond. The events are distributed through the month in a pattern that shows no preference for the pre-closure period. They kept happening after the window shut. And that distribution is the specific thing that breaks the stream model's explanatory power most cleanly. Think carefully about what a normal post-stream decay would look like in the data. If M2026A1 were the primary driver of April's activity, and if the stream genuinely ended on April 7th the way the model predicted, the month's event distribution would have a characteristic shape. High in the first week, Earth still near the densest part of the debris trail. Moderate in the second week, Earth moving into the stream's periphery. Low in the third and fourth weeks, Earth well past the stream boundary, encountering only background debris. The AMS numbers for April would show a downward slope. Maybe a steep one, maybe a gentle one, depending on how quickly the stream density fell off at its edges, but a slope, downward, toward normal. What the data shows instead is something that does not have that shape at all. It shows what you would call, in the language of time series analysis, a plateau. A sustained level of elevated activity that does not trend meaningfully downward as the month progresses past the closure date. And a plateau is not just quantitatively different from a decay curve, it is qualitatively different. It tells a different physical story entirely. A decay curve tells you that Earth is moving away from a concentrated debris region, leaving material behind as its orbital velocity carries it forward into cleaner space. The decreasing encounter rate directly reflects the decreasing density of the material Earth is moving through. Simple geometry, predictable physics. A plateau tells you something else. It tells you that as Earth moves away from one concentration of material, it is entering another at roughly the same density. That the debris environment ahead is approximately as populated as the debris environment behind. That there is no clean exit into lower density space waiting just past the stream boundary. A plateau is what you get when the elevated density is not a localized stream with defined edges but a region. A zone of space with relatively consistent elevated debris density that extends further than any single stream model can account for. Single stream models do not predict plateaus, they predict decay curves. The M2026A1 model, whatever its strengths, predicted a decay. The data is showing a plateau. That mismatch is not a minor discrepancy you can paper over with uncertainty ranges and error bars. It is a structural disagreement between what the model says should be happening and what is actually happening. Now add back the geographic undercount problem that we established earlier in this analysis, and the picture becomes more concerning still. The 2.5 times baseline rate for April is the number derived from AMS data. It counts events that generated sufficient reports in an English language platform, primarily used by North American and Western European skywatchers. It does not count the Buenos Aires bolide, which was confirmed by multiple independent video systems and AccuWeather tracking, and still has 0 AMS entries. It does not count events over the 71% of Earth's surface that is ocean. It does not count events in regions of Africa, South and Southeast Asia, and Central and South America, where reporting infrastructure and cultural penetration of meteor reporting platforms are significantly lower than in the monitored zones. The real April event rate, the actual global rate of significant atmospheric entries happening above every part of Earth's surface, counted with equal efficiency regardless of geography or language, is almost certainly higher than what the AMS data shows. How much higher is genuinely uncertain. Based on what we know about the geographic bias in the reporting system, researchers who study this problem estimate real global rates at roughly 3 to 4 times observed rates under normal conditions. Under current conditions, with a confirmed event over one of the largest cities in the Western Hemisphere producing 0 database entries, the undercount factor may be even larger. The 2.5 times baseline is the floor. The ceiling is unknown. Here is the part of the April story that I find most worth sitting with, because it reframes everything else. The M2026A1 model was not a failure. I want to be precise about that, because it matters for understanding where we actually are scientifically. The model predicted elevated activity for March 16th through April 7th. March was genuinely, robustly, multidimensionally anomalous in exactly the period the model identified. Schober's orbital analysis correctly characterized a real debris stream from a real parent body using real data. The predicted radiant cluster was real. The timing was broadly correct. The physical mechanism, sodium-driven fragmentation from a rock comet parent, was scientifically coherent and consistent with known behavior in analogous systems. That is a genuine scientific success. It is rarer than it sounds, and it deserves recognition as such. But here is the critical distinction that determines how we should think about the April situation. There is a difference between a model that is wrong and a model that is incomplete. A wrong model has made a fundamental error in its physics or its assumptions. Something in the core mechanics is broken, and the predictions it generates are unreliable because the underlying framework is flawed. You identify the error, discard the model, start over. An incomplete model has gotten the physics right for the portion of the system it described, has correctly characterized one piece of a larger reality, but has drawn its boundary in the wrong place. It has missed something. Not because the science inside the boundary was bad, but because the boundary itself was drawn too small. The M2026A1 model looks incomplete in this specific sense. Inside its window it worked. The boundary it drew, however, does not match where the anomaly actually ends. Everything beyond April 7th is territory. The model drew a line around and said, implicitly, by ending there, that we do not need to explain anything past this point. And reality has spent 3 weeks demonstrating that the line was drawn in the wrong place. An incomplete model is actually harder to deal with than a wrong one, in a specific and important way. A wrong model gives you a clean break. Discard and rebuild. An incomplete model contains real information mixed with gaps you have not yet identified. You cannot simply throw it out because the part it got right is genuinely useful and you do not want to lose it. But you cannot simply extend it because you do not yet know what it missed or why it missed it. You're stuck in the specific uncomfortable position of having a model that is partially correct and partially blind, and not yet knowing where the boundary between those two conditions falls. That is exactly where the science currently stands with M2026A1. It correctly described something real. It did not describe everything real, and the gap between what it described and what April is actually showing us is the frontier where the next explanation needs to be built. April is unexplained terrain. The plateau is real. The undercount makes it worse than the numbers show. And there is a third data stream, the Anthelian signal, that suggests the terrain extends even further and in directions the stream model was never designed to look. That is where this goes next. And it is the piece of the puzzle that changes the question from when does this end to something considerably more unsettling. Part 7. The Anthelian Shift. There is a direction in the sky called the Anthelian point. It's the point directly opposite the Sun from Earth's perspective, the geometric anti-solar direction. And it turns out that Earth, as it moves through its orbit, regularly sweeps up debris coming from that general direction, because objects in certain types of near-Earth orbits tend to intersect Earth's path from that angle. The Anthelian source is a well-known diffuse contributor to the global fireball background, not a discrete stream tied to a specific parent body, but a broad directional tendency in the arrival geometry of background debris. In the first quarter of 2026, January through March, events attributed to Anthelion source radiance roughly doubled compared to the previous records for that period. Doubled. Not a minor uptick. A doubling of activity from a source that is by definition not associated with a single identifiable parent object. This matters enormously for the interpretation of the current surge, and here's why. When a specific debris stream like M2026A1 is active, the events it produces have relatively clustered radiance. They come from a specific region of the sky associated with the stream's geometry. You can identify stream membership by checking whether a fireball's trajectory traces back to that part of the sky. When the stream ends, those clustered radiants disappear from the data. But Anthelion events don't have clustered radiants in that sense. They come from a broad, diffuse region of the sky that reflects Earth's own orbital motion through a background population of debris. They're not tied to one parent. They're not bounded by one orbital track. They represent a kind of environmental debris density that Earth moves through over extended periods. A doubling of Anthelion source events in Q1 is not explained by M2026A1. It's a separate signal. It suggests that the background debris environment through which Earth was moving in early 2026 was genuinely more populated with material than it typically is, not just in the direction of one specific stream, but in the general anti-solar direction that Earth continuously sweeps through. Here's the analogy I want you to hold. Think about the difference between driving through a specific rainstorm versus driving through a region with a higher baseline humidity and precipitation tendency. The rainstorm is the M2026A1 stream, intense, localized, temporary. The elevated regional humidity is the Anthelion signal, diffuse, directional, persistent. You can exit the rainstorm. You can't necessarily exit the region. And if the elevated Anthelion activity reflects a genuinely higher debris density in the sector of the solar system Earth is currently traversing, then the end of the M2026A1 window doesn't mean the end of the elevated activity. It means the dominant localized source has passed, but the broader environmental density hasn't changed. We may not be crossing a stream. We may be moving through a region that simply contains more material than our models expected. A denser than predicted sector of the inner solar system debris environment. and that possibility has very different implications for what happens next than the single stream model does. If it's a stream, you wait for it to end. If it's a region, the question becomes, how large is the region, and how long are we in it? The Anthelian data from Q1 suggests the elevated environment may have been developing for some time before the March spike, not triggered by it, which raises a genuinely unsettling possibility that what we experienced in March was the most intense part of a longer encounter with a poorly mapped debris zone, and that April's plateau is not the tail of a spike, but the plateau of a broader environmental condition. We're going to explore that idea in detail in the second half of this video, but first, we need to look at what happened in global distribution during the same period, because the geographic spread of events adds another layer to this story. Part 8. The global distribution problem. If all of the elevated fireball activity we've been describing came from a single, well-characterized debris stream, there's a specific prediction you'd make about where the events should appear. A discrete debris stream has a specific geometry. Earth moves through it at a specific angle, from a specific direction. The debris arrives from a specific radiant, and because Earth rotates about 15 degrees per hour, different parts of the planet are facing that radiant at different times. A stream with a well-defined geometry produces an event distribution that shows up preferentially in the parts of Earth facing the right direction at the right time. The math is precise. The geometry is trackable. What the April data shows is something different. Events occurring over South America, events over Western Canada, events over the Central Pacific, events scattered across multiple continents within windows of days to weeks. When you look at the radiant data available for the confirmed April events, the ones that have been analysed at all, the picture is not a tight cluster pointing back to a single source, it's a spread. That spread is consistent with the Anthelian interpretation we just discussed, multiple radiants, or a diffuse source geometry, but it's inconsistent with the M2026A1 model, which predicted a tighter radiant cluster in the Virgo Corvus Libra region of the sky. The Schober model's radiant prediction was one of its key distinguishing features, the ability to say not just when events would occur, but from which direction they should appear to arrive. If the post-April 7th events were tail activity from M2026A1, you'd expect them to share that same radiant cluster. A quick check of the available data doesn't confirm that. The geographic distribution is broader than a single localized stream should produce. What does a broader than expected distribution suggest? A few possibilities. First, that multiple debris streams are active simultaneously, with overlapping windows and different radiants, producing a composite distribution that looks diffuse because it literally is. Second, that there is a genuinely diffuse source, a cloud or region of debris rather than a discrete stream, whose geometry naturally produces events arriving from a spread of apparent radiance. Third, that our radiant analysis is incomplete, because we're only working with data from the fraction of events that got properly logged and analysed. All three possibilities lead to the same conclusion. The M2026A1 model, even if its core mechanics are correct, is not sufficient to explain the full pattern of what we're observing. The spatial distribution of events is too broad, the temporal persistence is too extended, the Anthelian signal is too strong and too early, and the post-window activity is too significant to be dismissed as statistical tail noise. The central question hasn't changed. We're still asking what Earth is flying through, but the global distribution data sharpens the answer. We're not just flying through the tail of one comet-like object's debris trail. Whatever we're in, it's bigger than that, more diffuse than that, and it doesn't respect the model's boundaries. That brings us to the model itself, because to understand where it failed, we first need to understand how impressive it was. Part 9. M2026A1, the first real explanation. Patrick M. Schober is a researcher who did something genuinely rare in near-Earth space science. He looked at a fresh anomaly, assembled observational data from multiple independent networks, applied rigorous orbital mechanics, and produced a testable prediction in time to actually matter. The dataset he worked with was substantial for this kind of work. 282 meteor detections drawn from coordinated global monitoring networks including FRIPON, the French-led Fireball Recovery and Interplanetary Observation Network, and the Global Meteor Network, which aggregates data from camera stations in dozens of countries, These networks operate continuously, capturing meteor events on standardized instruments with calibrated fields of view. The data from these systems can be processed to reconstruct meteor trajectories, calculate radiance, and in favorable cases determine pre-atmospheric orbits. It's not perfect. Coverage is still geographically biased, and small events still slip through, but it's the most systematic near-Earth debris monitoring capability available to the open scientific community. What Schober found in that data was a coherent stream, a population of meteoroid detections that shared orbital characteristics consistent with debris spread along a common orbital track. The parent body he proposed was a rock comet. This is a fascinating class of object, and it's worth spending a moment on the concept because it's genuinely interesting physics. Most people are familiar with the distinction between asteroids and comets. Asteroids are rocky, largely inert. They don't develop tails or undergo dramatic outgassing. Comets are icy, volatile rich. They develop spectacular tails when solar heating drives off their surface gases, and they scatter debris along their orbital tracks as they lose material. The debris streams that produce predictable annual meteor showers, the Perseids, the Leonids, are all comet-derived. You're watching Earth cross the debris trail of a periodic comet. Rock comets occupy a middle ground. They're predominantly rocky bodies, more like asteroids than traditional comets, but they contain specific mineral components that respond to solar heating with measurable outgassing or fragmentation. The most studied example is an asteroid called 3200 Phaethon, which is associated with the annual Geminid meteor shower. Phaethon approaches the Sun closely enough that solar heating drives off sodium and possibly other materials from its surface, producing a kind of thin comet-like behaviour. It's rocky, it's not icy, but it loses mass near perihelion and seeds its orbital track with debris. The proposed mechanism for M2026A1 involves sodium-driven fragmentation. As the parent body makes close solar passes, sodium, which has a relatively low vaporization temperature, is heated and expelled from the surface. This process gradually fragments the body and distributes material along its orbital track. The debris spread out over time. Earth crosses that track. We get the events we got in March and early April. The elegance of the model is that it doesn't require exotic physics. It uses a mechanism demonstrated in other rock comet systems. It made a precise prediction, and critically, it was peer-reviewed. It went through the process of scientific scrutiny and was considered credible enough to publish. In a landscape where most fireball anomaly discussion happens in informal online spaces or on social media channels, a peer-reviewed paper with 282 detections and a specific orbital model is a genuine scientific achievement. It's also incomplete, and we need to be very precise about what that incompleteness looks like. Part 10. The precision of the predicted window. The M2026A1 active window was March 16th to April 7th. Those are not approximations. That's not a range expressed as roughly mid-March to early April. The model produced specific dates, derived from the orbital mechanics of where Earth would be relative to the debris stream's path, and how long it would take Earth to transit the stream's cross-section at its orbital velocity. Orbital mechanics, done correctly, is extremely precise. The precision of the window was one of the model's strongest features. It wasn't just saying there will be elevated activity this spring. It was saying elevated activity will occur between these two dates and then stop. That precision is what makes the post-window events so significant. If the model had said elevated activity in spring 2026 with uncertainty of several weeks, then events occurring in late April would fall within the acknowledged uncertainty range. You could say the timing is consistent with the model, but that's not what the model said. It gave a cut-off date, and the events after that date, by 20 to 22 days, are not within any reasonable uncertainty margin for a model of this precision. To understand why the model was so precise, it helps to think about how debris streams behave in physical space. A stream is not a cloud with fuzzy edges. It's an orbital track, a specific path through the solar system defined by the original orbital parameters of the parent body. Debris spreads along that track over time due to differences in ejection velocity and subsequent orbital perturbations, but the main concentration of material remains near the parent's original orbit. Earth crosses that track at a defined angle, over a defined distance, at a defined velocity. The geometry is specific enough to give you a window in days, not months. If Earth enters the stream on March 16th and exits on April 7th, The width of the stream's cross-section as Earth traversed it was roughly 3 weeks of Earth's orbital travel distance. That's a physically meaningful constraint on the stream's geometry. And when events continue occurring 20 days after Earth should have exited that geometry, the options are limited. The stream was wider than modelled, there's additional debris outside the mainstream, there's a separate source, or some combination of these. What the precision of the model gives us is a precise failure. Not a vague inconsistency that could be explained by uncertainty. A clean, measurable gap between prediction and observation that demands explanation. And as of right now, that explanation doesn't exist in the peer-reviewed literature. There is no paper extending the M2026A1 model. There is no alternative stream identified. There is no published account of why April 27th looks the way it does. The model worked until it didn't, and the failure point is exactly where the story gets interesting. Part 11. The window closure failure. Let's be direct about what we're describing when we talk about the model failing after April 7th. We're not talking about edge cases. We're not talking about 1 or 2 stray events at slightly above background that might represent normal statistical fluctuation. We're talking about a sustained pattern of elevated activity, multiple major events, a continued 2.5 times baseline rate across the full month, occurring in a period when the model predicts activity should have returned to normal. The deviation is not subtle. It's not a rounding error, it's a pattern. The Buenos Aires event on April 27th is 20 days past the model's closure. 20. The British Columbia event on April 29th is 22 days past. These aren't borderline cases where you could argue whether an event falls just inside or just outside a defined window. They are, in the context of orbital mechanics and debris stream dynamics, far outside the predicted zone of activity. There's an important distinction worth drawing here between model breakdown and model incompleteness. A model that breaks down has made a fundamentally wrong assumption. Something in its core mechanics is incorrect, and the predictions it generates are wrong because the underlying physics is wrong. That's the most alarming kind of model failure. A model that's incomplete has gotten the physics right for the part of the system it described, but has failed to include all of the relevant components. The predictions it makes for the part of the system it described are correct, but there's more to the story than the model captured. The M2026A1 case looks more like the latter. The March predictions were broadly correct. The stream was real. The radiant cluster was real. The peak activity occurred roughly when and where the model said it would. But the model apparently didn't account for something. A debris tail that extends further than the main stream, an overlapping secondary source, an anthelion contribution that amplifies the background, some combination of factors. The core science isn't wrong. The boundaries are. That distinction matters because it determines what we do next. If the model is fundamentally broken, we throw it out and start fresh. If the model is incomplete, correct but bounded, we extend it. We ask what it missed. We look at the data beyond the predicted window and try to reverse engineer what it's telling us about the structure of the debris field we're apparently still inside. Right now, that work hasn't been done. The only peer-reviewed explanation for the spring 2026 surge ends on April 7th, and the anomaly has clearly outgrown its explanation. This is not a criticism of Schober's work. It was excellent science based on the data available. It's a statement about where the science currently stands relative to what the data is showing. There are several ways you could try to save the model, extend it, or replace it. Each has strengths and weaknesses, and none of them fully explains everything we're seeing. Part 12. 3 ways to save the model. The first option is the extended debris tail hypothesis. Debris streams don't have hard edges in physical space. The densest region, the main concentration of material near the parent body's original orbital track, is what produces the peak activity during the predicted window. But outside that central concentration, the stream has a diffuse periphery, older debris that has spread further from the main track due to the Poynting-Robertson effect, radiation pressure, and orbital perturbations accumulated over thousands of years. Earth could be passing through the outer edge of M2026A1's debris field, encountering material that was never concentrated enough to make it into the core stream model. The strength of this hypothesis is that it uses the same physics as the original model and doesn't require a new source. The weakness is that it doesn't easily explain the spatial distribution we discussed. If the post-window events were from the outer fringe of the M2026A1 stream, they should still have radiance broadly consistent with that stream's geometry. The broad geographic distribution of April events suggests that's not the complete answer. The second option is the multiple source hypothesis. The March surge was dominated by M2026A1, but April's continuation reflects the activity of one or more additional, uncharacterized debris streams that are currently unknown. These hypothetical streams could overlap in time with the tail of M2026A1, producing a seamless-looking continuation rather than a visible gap and restart. The strength of this hypothesis is that it naturally explains the broader radiant distribution. Multiple sources produce multiple radiants. The weakness is that it requires the existence of uncharacterized streams significant enough to maintain a 2.5 times baseline rate, which implies there are substantial debris populations near Earth that our detection systems haven't found yet. That's not impossible. It's actually part of what makes this moment uncomfortable. The third option is to accept incomplete modelling limitations, to acknowledge that the tools we currently have for characterizing debris streams in near-Earth space are not capable of producing complete models of complex multi-component debris fields. The model was as good as it could be given the available observational network and computational tools. The reality is richer and more complex than the model captured. This option doesn't require any specific alternative mechanism. It's an acceptance that we've encountered the frontier of our current modelling capability. The weakness of this option is that it's not particularly actionable. You can't extend a model whose gaps you don't understand. You can't predict what comes next if you're acknowledging that your predictions are inherently incomplete. But it may be the most honest assessment of where the science currently stands. None of these three approaches, on its own, explains all the features of what we're observing simultaneously. The broad distribution, the temporal persistence, the anthelion signal, the global undercount. Putting all of those together requires something more than any single extension of the existing model, and that points toward a possibility we'll get to in the final act, that we are not just in the tail of a specific known stream, but moving through a region of space that is genuinely more debris-dense than our long-term models of the inner solar system expected. But before we go there, we need to talk about something that affects every single thing we've discussed so far, something fundamental about how we observe near-Earth space and what we consistently fail to see, because there is an asteroid story from recent weeks that should have made more headlines than it did. Part 13. The 5-meter asteroid that nobody saw. A small asteroid passed Earth recently, below geosynchronous orbit, closer to our planet than the satellites that carry GPS signals and television broadcasts, approximately 5 meters in diameter, and nobody detected it in advance. Let that sit for a moment. An asteroid. Below the ring of human-built satellites, no warning, no announcement, just an object moving through the near-Earth environment, passing between us and our own infrastructure, and the first anyone knew about it was after it had already gone past. Now, 5 meters doesn't sound like much in astronomical terms. It's a boulder. It's not going to cause planetary catastrophe. But put it in a different context and it looks different. A 5-meter object is in the same size class as the bolides capable of producing meteorite falls, events like the Chelyabinsk meteor of 2013, which was estimated at roughly 20 meters, but whose forward scattered blast injured over 1,400 people and caused widespread structural damage across a region of Russia. A 5-meter object entering the atmosphere at typical impact velocities would release energy in the range of 100 to 1,000 tons of TNT equivalent, enough to cause significant local damage if it impacted a populated area. And that object, that specific class of object, passed inside geosynchronous orbit without detection. This is not a hypothetical risk scenario. This is something that actually happened. And the reason it happened is not a failure of any specific telescope or observatory. It's a consequence of the fundamental detection architecture we've built for near-Earth space. Our asteroid detection capabilities are optimized for large objects. There is a program called the SpaceGuard Survey, tasked with finding objects larger than 1 kilometer that could cause continental or global damage. The catalogue of those large objects is now reasonably complete. We've identified the vast majority of near-Earth asteroids above that threshold, and none of them pose a near-term impact risk. That's genuinely reassuring. At the catastrophic end of the scale, we've done decent work. Below 140 meters, the picture changes dramatically. At that size, an impactor would cause regional devastation, city-scale to country-scale destruction depending on geometry. The catalogue at this size is estimated to be perhaps 40 to 50% complete. We've found roughly half. The other half is out there, uncharacterized, with no known orbital data. Below 10 meters, the range that includes the recent Earth-grazing asteroid and the range most directly relevant to the fireball events we've been tracking, the catalogue is essentially empty. These objects are simply too small, too numerous, and too dark to be reliably detected by current survey telescopes in advance of their Earth approaches. They don't appear in our databases until they enter the atmosphere and burn, or until they pass so close that they're detected by chance during a survey sweep that happened to be pointed in the right direction at the right moment. This creates a profound and largely unacknowledged disconnect at the centre of near-Earth space science. We have excellent data on what's happening in the atmosphere. The fireballs we're discussing are real, and many of them are being tracked. But we have almost no data on what's approaching the atmosphere until it arrives. The 2.5 times baseline fireball rate in March and April 2026 is telling us something real is happening. But we cannot tell you right now what is currently on an approach trajectory toward Earth in the 5 to 20 meter range. We have no idea, not because of a specific detection failure, but because those objects are systematically below our detection floor. And if we're genuinely moving through a denser than expected region of near-Earth debris, which is the hypothesis the persistent post-window activity forces us to consider, then the population of undetected incoming objects in that size range is correspondingly higher than expected. The 5-meter asteroid that buzzed Earth without warning is not an anomaly. It's a sample, one data point from a distribution of objects we're not seeing. That should connect the detection problem directly back to what we've been building toward all along. The gap between the model's predictions and reality isn't just about scientific modelling, it's about what our entire detection architecture was built to find and what it consistently misses. Part 14. The detection flaw problem. Think of near-Earth asteroid detection as a fishing net. The net has a mesh size. Everything larger than the mesh gets caught. Everything smaller falls through. Our current net catches the large dangerous things reasonably well. The 1 kilometer and above objects that could end civilization are mostly in the catalogue. It catches the medium things inconsistently. The 100 to 140 meter range is partially catalogued, but full of gaps. And for anything smaller than about 10 meters, which covers the entire size range of the fireball events we've been discussing, the net is basically open water. These objects pass through our observation systems without a trace until they arrive. The reasons are well understood. Small asteroids are dark. Most near-Earth rocks have low albedo. They don't reflect much sunlight, which means they don't appear bright in telescope surveys. A 10-meter rock at 50,000 kilometers distance is extraordinarily difficult to detect even with modern survey instruments. Its angular motion is fast, which makes it harder to distinguish from artifacts in the data. Its window of detectability, the period during which it's both close enough to be bright enough and in the right orbital geometry to be seen, may be only hours to days before closest approach, and our current telescope networks were not designed or funded to survey the whole sky, fast enough to catch these small fast movers reliably. There are also geometric blind spots that go beyond the small size problem. Objects approaching Earth from the direction of the Sun, a class called sun grazers or sun-approaching impactors, are essentially invisible to ground-based optical surveys because you simply cannot point a telescope into the glare. Daytime impacts and near misses from solar approach directions are the hardest class of events to detect in advance. Chelyabinsk approached from a low solar angle and was not identified before impact, which was part of why it caught the world completely off guard. Now layer this detection flaw onto the fireball anomaly we've been examining. The events we've been discussing, the Buenos Aires bolide, the British Columbia fireball, the April cluster, are all in the 5 to 20 meter entry size range roughly. These are precisely the objects that fall below the detection flaw. We know about them because they entered the atmosphere and burned. We don't know about the companions they might have had. Similar sized objects that are on slightly different trajectories haven't encountered Earth yet but are part of the same debris population. We can't count them because we can't see them. This creates a uniquely uncomfortable epistemic position. We are detecting the impacts, or near impacts, of objects from a debris population we cannot survey in advance. We can study the population by its effects, the fireball distribution, the event frequency, the physical characteristics of the events themselves, but we cannot directly observe the population to characterize its size, density, or extent. It's like trying to map a storm by where the raindrops fall, with no instruments that look at the clouds. If the spring 2026 surge reflects an encounter with a denser than expected debris region, the detectable events are the signal. The undetectable companions, the objects that didn't happen to intersect Earth's path or haven't yet, are the noise floor we can't characterize. And the gap between what we detect and what actually exists out there might be several times larger than the ratio our geographic reporting biases already suggest. We detect the rare giants, but miss the frequent small objects. And right now, the frequent small objects are showing up in numbers that our best current model cannot explain, which means we're navigating with instruments that have a known, fixed structural blind spot in territory that appears to be more populated than our maps predicted. Part 15. Ocean and Geographic Blind Spots. 71% of Earth's surface is ocean. That number is relevant to every conversation about fireball rates, impact risk, and debris distribution, and it almost never appears in the summaries. When people talk about fireball frequency, they're talking about fireballs that were reported. Reported fireballs are fireballs that someone saw or that an automated land-based detector caught. A fireball that occurs over the South Pacific at 4 in the morning has no witnesses, no camera network underneath it, and no reporting pipeline. It enters the atmosphere, burns spectacularly, deposits its energy into the air column and disappears. The only way it ever enters a database is if a weather satellite with the right sensitivity happened to be looking at the right spot of sky at the right moment, which does occasionally happen but is far from systematic coverage. The AMS database, which we've been using as our primary source for the statistical analysis of the spring 2026 surge, covers the regions of the world where English-speaking sky watchers congregate in meaningful numbers, which is predominantly the continental United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, and parts of Western Europe. South America is undercounted, Africa is dramatically undercounted, Central and Southeast Asia are undercounted, and the ocean surface, which covers most of the planet, is essentially uncounted except for the satellite detection systems that weren't specifically designed for this purpose. The practical consequence of this geographic bias, when you try to apply it to the current surge, is significant. Researchers who study the relationship between reported fireball rates and actual fireball rates, accounting for geographic coverage, reporting penetration, and observational geometry, consistently estimate that the true global fireball rate is roughly 3 to 4 times the observed rate. Not 10% higher, not 50% higher, 3 to 4 times. Which means if we're observing a 2.5 times baseline rate in the regions we're monitoring, the actual global rate might be closer to 6 or 8 times baseline. We genuinely don't know. What we do know is that the Buenos Aires event fits this pattern almost perfectly. It occurred over one of the most populous urban areas in South America, an area with excellent infrastructure and widespread smartphone and camera coverage, and it still didn't enter the primary database. Think about that for a moment. If that's what happens to a fireball over Buenos Aires, what happens to a fireball over the central Amazon basin, over the Bengala Current off the southwest African coast, over the Tasman Sea? These aren't hypothetical detection challenges. These are real parts of the planet experiencing real atmospheric events that leave no trace in any scientific database. The Buenos Aires gap isn't an isolated failure. It's a representative sample of a systematic undercount that affects our entire understanding of what's happening above Earth right now. And when we're trying to determine whether the M2026 A1 model's closure date was accurate, we're working with a dataset that may be missing the majority of the events that would help us answer that question. So the surge may be significantly underestimated. The geographic blind spots compound the detection flaw problem, and layered on top of both of those, the data itself has quality issues that we need to briefly acknowledge. Part 16. Data Integrity and the CNEOS Problem. The Center for Near-Earth Object Studies, NASA's primary fireball database, is the most official-sounding reference for high-energy atmospheric entry events. It gets cited in news articles, referenced in scientific papers, used as the authoritative source for significant bolide events. It carries considerable institutional weight. It also has known accuracy problems for smaller events. There have been documented cases of coordinate errors in CNEOS fireball data, reported locations that were off by hundreds or even thousands of miles from where the event actually occurred. The most notable case involved an event that was mislocated by approximately 1,800 miles in the database. 1,800, not a calibration offset of a few dozen kilometers that might reflect the limits of infrasound triangulation, a mislocation of continental scale. The accuracy problem is specifically worse for smaller events, those below roughly 0.45 kilotons of estimated energy, which corresponds to objects smaller than a few meters. At larger energies, multiple independent detection methods, infrasound, seismometers, optical satellites, triangulate the event and constrain the location more accurately. At lower energies, the event may be detected by only one or two systems, and the geometric uncertainties are much larger. The current surge includes events in exactly this lower accuracy range. The fireball events we've been tracking are largely sub-kilometer objects whose atmospheric entries release energies well below the CNEOS accuracy threshold, which means even the most official dataset for these events carries an uncertainty in location that could scatter an event by hundreds of miles from its actual occurrence point. Not useful for detailed trajectory analysis, not reliable for comparing event locations to predicted radiant distributions, and not reassuring when you're trying to determine whether post-window activity is concentrated in a region consistent with stream geometry or distributed in a pattern inconsistent with it. This doesn't mean CNEOS data is useless. It doesn't mean we should discard it. It means we need to cross-validate it, use it with appropriate uncertainty acknowledgement, and recognize that the precision implied by a specific latitude-longitude coordinate in the database may not reflect the actual precision of the measurement. In the current context, it means that some of the geographic distribution analysis we'd ideally want to do, mapping post-window event locations against M2026A, 1 radiant geometry to test for stream association, is significantly hampered by data quality that wasn't designed for this level of scrutiny. Every layer of the data problem points in the same direction. The geographic coverage is biased. The reporting rates are uneven. The official databases have documented accuracy problems for small events, and the whole system is operating under conditions, an anomaly that has outgrown its best current model, for which it was never specifically designed. What we're working with is the best available picture of an incomplete reality. And even in that incomplete picture, something is clearly wrong with the assumption that the spring 2026 surge ended on April 7th. Now let's ask the hardest question. What are we actually flying through? Part 17. Extended stream versus overlapping systems. There are fundamentally two families of hypotheses for what Earth is moving through right now, and they have different implications for what comes next. The first family says this is still primarily about M2026A1, that the stream is real, was correctly characterized, but is larger in its extent than the model captured. The core stream that produced the March peak was correctly mapped, but streams don't end like a door closing. They thin out over distance, and the tail of M2026A1, the lower density peripheral debris outside the main orbital concentration, may extend significantly further than the observed detection data could constrain during the modelling process. Earth is still in the tail. The tail is lower density than the core, but still above background. And because we know from the Buenos Aires analysis that our reporting systems miss a meaningful fraction of real events, the tail's true density is higher than the database numbers suggest. This hypothesis has the virtue of parsimony. It uses the existing model, extends it in a physically plausible way, and doesn't require any additional sources or mechanisms. Its weakness is that it doesn't obviously explain the anthelion signal. The Q1 anthelion doubling suggests elevated activity from a direction that's not associated with M2026A, one's radiant cluster. You can't fit the anthelion data into a single stream tail hypothesis without doing significant damage to the model's coherence. The second family says there are multiple overlapping sources. M2026A1 explains March and early April, but one or more additional uncharacterized streams are independently contributing to activity in a time window that overlaps with M2026A1's tail. These could be streams from different parent bodies, rock comets, or asteroid families with orbital resonances that bring their debris to Earth-crossing geometry in the same spring window. Or they could be dynamically related fragments of a larger parent object that broke up and scattered debris across a range of orbital parameters. This hypothesis naturally explains both the anthelion signal, which would represent a separate source with different radiant geometry, and the post-window persistence. Its weakness is that it requires the existence of significant uncharacterized debris sources, which implies either that our surveys have missed something substantial or that these sources are new, created by a recent fragmentation event that we haven't yet identified. And there's a hybrid possibility sitting between those two families, that we're in a genuinely diffuse debris environment that isn't organized into discrete streams at all, or at least not into streams in the way our stream-based models are designed to characterize. A zone of relatively higher small body density in the inner solar system, shaped by some combination of historical fragmentation events, gravitational resonance-driven delivery from the main asteroid belt, and cometary dust contribution that our orbital surveys have systematically undersampled because it's populated by objects below the detection floor. Evaluating which of these is closest to correct is the work that needs to happen, and right now it's not being done, at least not publicly and at the pace the data demands. The post-window events have accumulated to the point where the question is urgent. We need new models, and we need the observations to constrain them. Part 18. Burns 3 Factor Framework. A researcher named Stephen Burns has proposed a framework for thinking about why near-Earth debris encounter rates might be increasing that's worth engaging with seriously, because it doesn't rely on any single anomalous stream or unusual parent body. It's a systemic argument. Burns identifies 3 independent factors that influence how much debris Earth encounters over time, and argues that understanding their interaction is necessary to explain variability in fireball rates at the scale we're currently observing. The first factor is Earth's orbital motion through the heliocentric debris environment. Earth moves through the inner solar system at roughly 30 kilometers per second. The debris it encounters is not uniformly distributed. The solar system has structure shaped by gravitational resonances, the historical distribution of cometary deliveries, collisional cascades in the asteroid belt, and dynamical processes that concentrate material in some orbital zones and deplete it from others. As Earth orbits, it samples different parts of this structured environment. Certain sectors of the inner solar system are intrinsically more populated with small bodies than others, and Earth's annual orbit takes it through those sectors at predictable times of year. The second factor is the solar system's own motion through the Milky Way galaxy. The entire solar system is travelling at roughly 240 kilometers per second around the galactic centre, and this motion takes it through different density environments of interstellar material over millions of years. More relevantly for shorter timescales, the solar system's galactic orbit causes it to periodically pass through the galactic plane, the densest region of the Milky Way disk, which some researchers have associated with periodic increases in comet delivery to the inner solar system. If we're currently near or in a gravitationally active zone of the galactic environment, the rate of cometary and asteroidal material being delivered to Earth-crossing orbits over timescales of thousands to millions of years could be modestly elevated. This is a longer cycle phenomenon, but it potentially sets a background condition that influences shorter-term encounter rates. The third factor is the current state of the asteroid delivery mechanisms, specifically the dynamical processes that move material from the main asteroid belt into Earth-crossing orbits. Gravitational resonances with Jupiter and other giant planets create regions of the asteroid belt where orbital configurations become unstable over timescales of thousands to tens of millions of years. Objects that drift into these resonance zones are accelerated onto highly elliptical orbits that bring them into the inner solar system. The current population of near-Earth objects reflects the balance between this delivery process and the rate at which objects are ejected, fall into the Sun, or impact planets. If recent collisional events in the asteroid belt have injected fresh material into resonance zones, the delivery rate to Earth-crossing orbits could be elevated over a period of thousands of years, a long cycle effect that shows up as an elevated background in any shorter time window we measure. The strength of this framework is that it doesn't require any single unusual event or anomalous stream. It explains variability as a structural consequence of Earth's situation in a complex, multi-scale gravitational environment, and it makes a sobering prediction. If we are in a period of intrinsically higher debris delivery, driven by galactic position, asteroid belt dynamics, or some combination, the elevated encounter rates we're seeing may not be a temporary spike that resolves cleanly back to a previous normal. They may represent a new, somewhat higher baseline that persists until the underlying dynamical conditions change. The weakness is testability. These are long-cycle phenomena operating on timescales from thousands to millions of years. Testing them directly against a 2-month anomaly in 2026 requires extrapolating from long-term trends to short-term observations, which carries enormous uncertainty. The framework explains why elevated rates are possible. It doesn't definitively explain why they're happening right now in this specific spring, at this specific magnitude, but it does shift the question in an important way. Instead of asking, why is there a spike and when will it end? We should perhaps also be asking, what is the new baseline and how much has it shifted? Because those two questions have very different answers and very different implications for planetary defense, near-Earth space monitoring, and our practical understanding of the risk environment Earth occupies. Part 19. The uncomfortable possibility. Here is the hypothesis I want to put in front of you directly, because it's sitting in the data and nobody is saying it clearly. What if the number of Earth-crossing small bodies, objects in the 1 to 20 meter range, below the detection floor, above the typical grain size of meteoric dust, has genuinely increased over a period of years, and we are only now noticing because the increase has crossed the threshold of our reporting system's sensitivity? This is not the same as saying an asteroid is going to hit us. It's not a prediction of catastrophe. It's a hypothesis about background conditions, and it would explain several things simultaneously that the stream-specific models struggle to explain individually. It would explain the Anthelian doubling in Q1, which implies elevated background debris density from a broad directional source rather than a specific narrow stream. It would explain why March was anomalous across so many independent variables simultaneously, not just frequency but size distribution, sonic boom rates, duration statistics, radiant spread. A genuine increase in the population of incoming small bodies would produce exactly that kind of multivariable anomaly. It would explain why April hasn't decayed back to baseline. If the background population is elevated, every month will look elevated, not just the months when a specific known stream is active. And it would explain why the M2026A1 model succeeded within its window and failed outside it. The stream was a real, identifiable concentration within a background that is itself already anomalous. What could cause a genuine increase in the Earth-crossing small body population? A few mechanisms are worth naming. Recent collisional fragmentation events in the main asteroid belt or among near-Earth populations can inject fresh material into Earth-crossing orbits. A large collision between two sizable asteroid belt objects, the kind of event that happens on timescales of hundreds of thousands to millions of years but is not continuous, produces a cascade of smaller fragments, some of which diffuse into resonant zones and eventually into the inner solar system. If a significant belt collision occurred in the relatively recent astronomical past, the material delivery chain could be producing an elevated flux of small bodies in the inner solar system right now. Orbital resonance shifts, changes in the resonance structure of the asteroid belt driven by gradual drift in planetary orbital parameters over millions of years, could be delivering material to Earth-crossing orbits at a higher rate than was typical 1,000 years ago. Earth's historical impact record suggests these delivery rates are not constant over geological time. We're in a period between major events, but that doesn't mean the background is fixed, and there's the possibility, currently speculative but not implausible, that a relatively recent breakup of a near-Earth asteroid or short-period comet has spread debris along an orbital track that overlaps extensively with Earth's path in ways we haven't fully characterized. Not just one stream like M2026A1, but several overlapping streams from the same fragmentation event, spread across a range of similar but slightly different orbital parameters, producing a zone of elevated debris density that extends across weeks to months of Earth's annual orbit. None of these mechanisms are science fiction. They're all physically real processes that operate in the solar system. What's uncertain is whether any of them are currently operating at a rate sufficient to produce what we're observing. And the only way to begin answering that question is to acknowledge that the current data pattern, sustained 2.5 times baseline for 2 consecutive months, post-window persistence, Anthelian doubling, broad geographic distribution, is inconsistent with our prior models of what normal looks like. The uncomfortable possibility is that normal has shifted, that we are in a period of genuinely elevated near-Earth debris activity, not because of a one-time stream encounter, but because the broader debris environment we're moving through has changed in ways our current survey systems weren't designed to detect. And if that's true, the implications extend well beyond the spring of 2026. Part 20. The stakes. Let me be precise about scale, because precision matters more here than drama. The fireball events we've been discussing are largely in the 1 to 5 metre size range, maybe up to 10 metres for the most energetic of the April events. At those sizes, an atmospheric impact is a local event. Dramatic, potentially damaging if it occurs directly over a populated area, but not regionally catastrophic. The Buenos Aires bolide, if it had completed its atmospheric entry over the city centre, rather than burning up at altitude, would have produced a bright flash, a pressure wave, possibly some sonic damage, broken windows, frightened people. It would have been news. It would not have been a disaster on the scale of a nuclear weapon or a major natural catastrophe. That context matters. We are not talking about existential risk in what we're observing right now, but the distribution of sizes matters more than any single event. Small impacts are the visible tip of a size-frequency distribution that extends upward. For every 10-metre object entering Earth's atmosphere, there are statistically somewhere between 10 and 100 50-metre objects in the same population. For every 50-metre object, in the range of the Tunguska event of 1908, which flattened approximately 2,000 square kilometres of Siberian forest with no impact crater, just from airburst, there are hundreds of smaller ones. We don't detect the 50-metre objects in this size class in advance. We don't catalogue them. We don't track their orbital parameters. They exist in a detection gap that our current planetary defence architecture was not designed to close. Chelyabinsk in 2013, roughly 20 metres, not detected in advance, injured over 1,400 people, caused extensive structural damage across a populated Russian region. That event arrived without warning on a morning when global attention was focused on a different asteroid that had been detected and was making a close approach the same day. We were watching the known object. We missed the arriving one. Tunguska, in 1908, estimated 30 to 60 metres, unknown composition, complete atmospheric burst that left no crater but devastated a remote forest equivalent in area to a major metropolitan region. If that event's entry geometry had been slightly different, hitting over London or Paris or St. Petersburg at the time, it would have been one of history's worst disasters. These are not hypothetical extremes. They are recent events in geological terms, and they sit in the size class above what we're currently observing, which means any genuine increase in the background rate of 1 to 10 metre objects implies a corresponding proportional increase in the background rate of the objects that could produce a Chelyabinsk or a Tunguska. That's the stakes question, not whether the current fireballs are dangerous in themselves, but what they imply about the broader size distribution of the population we're moving through. If the 10 metre and below rate is 2.5 times historical average and rising, and if that rate reflects a genuine increase in the near-Earth debris population, rather than a temporary stream encounter, then the rate for 20 metre objects is also elevated. The rate for 50 metre objects is also elevated, not by enough to make a Tunguska-scale event imminent tomorrow, but by enough to shift the probability distribution in a direction we should be paying attention to. And we're not. Fully. Not yet. The planetary defence community is doing serious work. DART demonstrated kinetic deflection. Space-based survey telescopes are being developed to push the detection threshold lower. Progress is real, but the timeline for getting those detection capabilities operational stretches over years, and the current anomaly is happening now. There's also a systemic problem that the current situation exposes with particular clarity. Our detection architecture was designed based on models of the near-Earth debris environment as it was understood when those systems were designed. If the debris environment is changing, if the background rate is shifting, if new streams are forming, if the sector of the inner solar system we currently occupy is denser than our long-term models assumed, then the detection system designed for the old environment may systematically miss features of the new one. We know we're hitting more objects than usual, the data is clear on that. We don't know why. The model that was supposed to explain it ended 3 weeks ago, and the anomaly didn't. And we don't know what's next, not because the science is bad, but because the science hasn't yet caught up to what the data is telling us. That is where we actually are right now. Not in panic, not in certainty, in the specific kind of uncertainty that comes from standing at the edge of what your instruments and models were designed to see, looking into territory that is clearly there but not yet mapped. The sky over Buenos Aires lit up on April the 27th. The sky over British Columbia lit up 2 days later. The sky over Hawaii did something unusual in the same window. The model said the window closed 20 days before that. The database undercount means the real rate is almost certainly higher than the official numbers show. The detection flaw means there are objects in the same size class approaching Earth right now that we cannot see. And the best current scientific explanation, as good as it was, doesn't account for any of what happened after April 7th. Final part, the view from here. There is a version of this story where everything resolves cleanly. The Schober model gets extended, a second stream is identified, the data catches up to the events, the April anomaly gets explained, archived and filed next to other solved mysteries, the baseline decays. Spring 2027 looks more like every other spring in the record. The solar system, it turns out, was just going through something temporary. That version might be correct, I'm not ruling it out. But there is another version where the April pattern is not a temporary deviation but a new signal, where what we're experiencing reflects a genuine, ongoing change in the debris density of the inner solar system that our current survey systems were not built to detect, our current models were not built to predict, and our current detection infrastructure is not equipped to warn us about. That version is also possible, maybe more possible than we'd like. What I can tell you with confidence is where the science stands right now, in late April of 2026. We have a 2-month sustained spike in fireball activity that crosses the boundary of the only peer-reviewed explanation that exists for it. We have a global geographic distribution of events that's inconsistent with a single stream model. We have anthelion doubling that predates the peak activity and suggests an elevated background that goes beyond any specific identified stream. We have a detection architecture with known structural blind spots that systematically undercounts the very events we're trying to analyze. We have databases with known accuracy problems at the size class most relevant to the current anomaly. And we have an asteroid that passed inside geosynchronous orbit last month without a single advance warning being issued. What we don't have is an explanation that ties all of those threads together into a coherent, verified, predictive account of what's happening. That account doesn't exist yet. It's being built, piecemeal, by individual researchers working with incomplete data and insufficient funding to move faster, but it isn't finished. And while it's being built, the sky keeps doing what it's been doing since March 16th. There's something that strikes me about the Buenos Aires event specifically. 13 million people saw that sky light up green. They looked up, nearly all of them instinctively, the way humans have always looked up at sudden light in the darkness. And they saw something real. Something that moved faster than anything they'd ever watched cross the sky, brighter than any weather phenomenon, stranger than any human-made light show. They experienced a brief, electric moment of contact with a universe that normally holds itself at a polite astronomical distance, and then it was over, and none of them knew that the model that should have explained it was already 3 weeks past its expiration date. None of them knew that the database that should have captured what they saw didn't have a single record of their experience. None of them knew that somewhere in the same solar system, other fragments from the same or similar debris populations were tracing their own invisible paths through interplanetary space, and that whether those paths would intersect Earth's again tomorrow or in 1,000 years was a question for which the honest answer is, we don't currently know. They just looked up, and the sky lit green, and then went dark. The universe is not required to behave according to our models. It never has been. The history of science is largely the history of reality outrunning our descriptions of it. Models that worked until they didn't, predictions that held until they broke, maps that reflected our understanding rather than the territory itself. The M2026A1 model is the latest chapter in that history. It was good science. It was the best available science. And the sky over Buenos Aires on April 27th didn't care about any of that. There is something both humbling and clarifying about that. We have built extraordinary tools. We have mapped the solar system with precision that would have been incomprehensible to any generation that came before us. We have sent spacecraft to every planet, landed instruments on asteroids, imaged the surfaces of comets from close range. We understand orbital mechanics at a level of detail that lets us predict planetary positions centuries in advance. By any historical standard, what we know about near-Earth space is remarkable. And still, a green bolide crossed the sky over 13 million people in the middle of a night in late April, 3 weeks after the only model that could explain it said it shouldn't exist. The database didn't catch it. The detection systems didn't see it coming. The model's window had closed, and the sky lit up anyway. We know we're hitting more objects than usual. We don't know why, and we don't know what's next. That's not a comfortable place to be. But it's an honest one, and the first step toward the kind of science that might actually give us better answers is being honest about how much of the picture we're currently missing. The dark data, the detection flaws, the geographic blind spots, the model boundaries, and building the next generation of tools, networks, and theories with those gaps explicitly in view. The Earth is moving through something right now that our best current models did not fully anticipate. That sentence should be on the wall of every planetary defense office on the planet, not as a source of alarm, as a prompt to work harder, look more carefully, and stop mistaking the edge of our models for the edge of what's out there. Because whatever we're flying through, it doesn't care where our models end.